I'm Robert Orsi. It's good to be here and to see everybody in person. I want to add to the gratitude that Kathy so graciously began expressing earlier. I want to add to this our gratitude to the Office of the President here at Notre Dame, which has generously funded this project. I should also add that I'm familiar with projects at other universities and at other Catholic universities that on the subject of clerical sexual abuse. And I've heard very mixed reports from other universities that very often, these projects are funded, but then they're heavily surveilled. They're carefully guarded. They're often meant in a way as a kind of cover-up rather than as a true, not on the part of the scholars involved, who always are there with the best of intentions and the most serious of intentions, but they're used by administrations to as a kind of front in a way, as a kind of Potemkin project. But I want to say about this, and I knew, of course, coming into this because of my deep and years-old respect for Kathy, that this would not happen here. I knew that would not happen here, but still I was apprehensive. And I have to say there hasn't been a hint of this. We have been allowed to follow our research ideas and to follow our agendas and wherever they were going to take us. And for that, I am truly grateful to Notre Dame for giving us that. So we have three superb presentations tonight. I will introduce all three people now. And you have the actually in your packets are the little bios. I could read from those, but I would prefer to say just something very personal about each person, which is that Marie, in addition to what you see there about Marie, Marie has done truly transformative research on the field of religion and sexuality in the United States. She is the director of the John Danforth Center of Religion on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, so that you can read. But if you haven't read her works on the way in which sexuality and the body feature fundamentally in American political discourse as touch points for conflict, they're just magnificent and important studies. Terence McKiernan, the founder of bishopaccountability.org, has proven for this to be for this project just the deepest of resources and an inspiration by his dedication, his commitment, and his generosity. And really, that's more a gratitude. And Kathy, of course, who we all know and love as the director of the Cushwa Center, who has had us here and feted us and fed us. Now probably longer, you've been the director longer than Jay Dolan was, correct? Yes, she has been longer than Jay Dolan. She is not wearing plaid pants yet, but, and you golf? No golfing yet, but that could come. I mean, maybe I thought that was a requirement, actually. But, Kathy has done just fabulous historiographical work on women religious, and more recently on saints in the United States and the politics of sainthood. So the politics and process of sainthood. So what better group of people could there be? Are we going in the order that I have here on my piece of paper? So Marie, this starts with you. Are you ready? Okay. Please welcome to the podium Marie Griffith.
Thank you all so much for being here. And I just want to echo the thanks that others have shared to the directors of this project and also to Terry for just phenomenal research help. I want to say that I've spent the last 2 weeks in Boston and spent more hours with Terry than he ever cared to spend with me in the Bishop Accountability headquarters. And it's just been extraordinary. So my understanding of this symposium is we're presenting somewhat informally and just have 20 minutes to present what is really for all of us an enormous amount of research. So I'm going to try to talk somewhat informally here, but I do obviously have my notes. Like most or all of you, I would guess, every dimension of the clergy sexual abuse catastrophe fascinates, mystifies, and outrages me. And there is so much that needs to be examined and written about it. And again, I'm just grateful that this project has given some of us the opportunity to do that for the first time. And that's my experience. I've never written about this before. And I'm also just so grateful to others of you here who have spent years in the trenches already on this subject and from whom I have already learned so much. And I know I'm going to learn more this weekend. I am a Protestant, I want to say at the outset, which has some obvious disadvantages for my study. I'm not well versed in the plethora of administrative roles held by priests in diocesan offices, for instance. And so the chain of command, which is actually very important understanding this crisis, sometimes is challenging for me to understand. But also coming from the outside maybe helps me register surprise at certain dimensions of the crisis that may be easy to gloss over from the inside. And also, I'm very familiar with a number of similar crises in the Protestant world across many Protestant denominations. So there's a sort of comparative dimension there as well, which I'm happy to talk about. So my chief focus in this project is on women. And most of the work that I've done to date in this project has largely focused on female survivors of clergy abuse. Now, for a whole host of reasons, and many of them legitimate ones, the typical targets of sexually abusive priests in the church have been imagined to be boys, altar boys for the most part, but also boys both younger and older than that, across lines of class, race, and geography. This is how the Boston Globe series covered the scandal from the start. It's how the John Jay study, the numbers bear that out. But as more and more cases have multiplied, it's become ever more clear that a significant number of clergy abuse victims have been girls, both prepubescent and adolescent, and also that adult women have also suffered abuse. Now, there's still, after all these years, very little sound data on the estimated gender breakdown of clergy abuse victims. Or maybe I should say there's a significant gap between current scholarly estimates and about the number of female victims and the way survivors themselves often think about this. So, the Globe numbers tended to show 80% male victims, 20%. That 80-20 is often the kind of what we have in our mind. Female survivors I've interviewed from there talking with other women, think it's much closer to 50-50. The truth somewhere in between there, I would suspect, but we really don't have the data. We just know there's, I think, a lot more girls and women than we've acknowledged in the past. The need, perhaps, to make the clergy abuse scandal all about homosexuality and the loose morals that were unleashed by the 1960s in one telling is one reason critics have given for why it's generally told as a story about boys. And as Terry actually put it to me when we were talking about the McCarrick report over email once, the entire power structure enclosing and essentially guarding the practice of clergy abuse has had no interest in girls. That's a quote from Terry. Now, we can think about why have the girls been so invisible? And there are broader cultural reasons, far beyond the church context, why this is true. We know in the broader culture, female victims of abuse often imagine this to be their fault. Boys imagine that too, but for girls, it's almost considered not abuse at all. It's sort of normal in a way. There's also factors having to do more specifically with the church. So one survivor, Joelle Castick, cites a study that found that clergy in conservative organizations that promote male-only leadership tend to blame female victims, this is a quote from her, adhere to rape myths, and misunderstand the practices and results of predatory grooming. So my interest is not in saying the abuse has been worse for girls than for boys. There's no metric for that, obviously. But it is to say that a gendered analysis of some of this, I think, helps us see the crisis from new angles and important ones at that. So I'm trying to bring a sort of feminist lens and gender analysis to my own work here. And others of us in this project are doing that as well, including Kathy and Doris and several others. The work I've done so far has basically divided into two parts. The first has been a very focused look at a single archdiocese in which significant clergy abuse of girls occurred, and that is the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. That's a very interesting case, which of course journalists have written about quite a bit, but there's not a ton of scholarship on that. But because of the California laws, the way the abuse lawsuits played out in California, Archbishop Roger Mahony, Cardinal Roger Mahony's files became public somewhat early, even as others remain even now under lock and key. The Archdiocese was required to release confidential personnel files in 2013 as part of a massive settlement of civil lawsuits. And this has provided in very close detail an accounting of how clergy abuse was handled at these various bureaucratic levels inside the church. And Mahony himself has been a fascinating figure to study. The LA Times journalists have called him singular. I'm not sure he's so singular, but he's undoubtedly emblematic of broader church efforts to contain and manage priestly abuse cases while staving off parents and law enforcement and the media. He's really been quite brilliant. So thanks to Terry and Bishop Accountability, I've had the chance to dig deeply into the files of such notorious abusers of girls as George Rucker, Santiago Tamayo, Joseph Alzugare, and many, many others. And it's just been richly informative in illuminating the attitudes of Mahony and his staff toward the women who came to them as adults, or some mothers in some cases, and really came with trust that the church would do the right thing, that they would deal justly with abusers. It also shows the feelings of grievance that these church leaders displayed toward female lawyers, such as Gloria Allred, who played an important role as a young woman before she was well known. One internal memo called her a flamboyant individual who specializes in civil suits on behalf of women's liberation movements, so making her, suspect in that way. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that here because I want to focus more on the female survivor voices. But if anyone else has worked on Los Angeles, I'd be really interested in speaking with you. And I'm happy to say more about that context as well. The second part, in part because I wasn't sure I wanted to write a archdiocesan history so much, the second part really pivots away from that and has concentrated on the stories of, thus far, just a handful of adult women who were abused as young girls and teens. So again, I've got very rich primary and secondary sources, and these have also been supplemented by 7 so far interviews with survivors, and this research is continuing long beyond this project, obviously, so I'm at a very early stage of all this. But this part of my work is really trying to consider some ways that gender may matter in the life experiences of girls who have been abused by priests. Female survivors are well aware of and frustrated by the fact that there's been so much scant writing about sexually abused girls. We've been fighting for the women's voices to be heard for a long time, is sort of a typical sentiment that I've heard. The women's narratives are as similar as they are unique. Of course, every story is unique. But they're all filled with pain as well as defiance. They follow something of a general arc, since these are women, the ones I've interviewed, who have been involved with SNAP and other organizations for many years and have really spent years working through much of their experience. 4 of my interviewees were repeatedly assaulted by a priest between the ages of 6 and 12. And then 3 were habitually abused by a priest as teenagers, starting around 14 or 15, and in one case moving well into adulthood, into her mid-20s, long past the age of consent, but years after the power to consent had been taken away from her. And obviously these are very different types of experiences, as Katie helped me see in our last discussion of this work, that the experience of a 6-year-old girl being abused versus a 15 or 16-year-old teenager are just very, very different. So let me just say a couple words about little girls and then talk about teens. So the stories from the women of being raped as little girls, are harrowing, and I can't really bear actually to go into all the details here. But one of my interviewees told me in great detail how the priest told her she was an evil child, and that he had been sent by God to save her soul, and then he raped her. And she believed this was her punishment for being bad. She said to me, I didn't know what he had done to me. I knew it hurt. I knew I was terrified. And I knew I didn't want my parents to find out just how evil I was. So this began at age 6 and continued for 6 or 7 years as the priest continued to rape and sodomize her and other children, girls and boys, and eventually began inviting other priests to join him. And he told Pamela, as the pseudonym I've given her, that if she prayed to God with a pure heart, the rapes would not hurt, for God would never allow an innocent child to suffer. She was desperately hoping her parents would never find out because she knew she'd be in so much trouble for all of this. She tried to be good so that the rapes would stop. And then she says, but I was never good enough. And this is kind of the one sort of common type of narrative that I've heard over and over. I spent my childhood looking for a safe place, feeling like a bad girl, and so forth. And then and I just want to say, she has asked me to share the fact that she is here, Patty Marchant. I interviewed her, and Patty's gone very public with her story and wanted me to use her name here. I was chosen, you told me, of how this youngish priest, fresh out of seminary, picked you, to bring him a carton of milk every morning for breakfast. And the principal, allowed this, and this was sort of celebrated. I was treated as if I was special, she said to me. And the priest invited her to sit on his lap. He would bring me closer and bring me closer until he finally, in her words, raped me in every way possible. He told her that she was such a special little girl. This is all about love, which was part of all of this. And you didn't buy it at the time, you told me, but you insist that this too was abuse. And you said, excuse my expression, but it is a clear mind F to be told that. So the damage to children of intertwined sexual and spiritual abuse, because it's both, as we know, is really profound. The effect of just vast and constant terror, this feeling of being a bad child, a bad girl, never finding a safe place. And Patty, just to quote you again, this is where the title of my presentation today comes from. You said, all the dear, lovely survivors I've met in my life, which have been thousands, literally now, and clergy abuse survivors who I just love for being who they are, we all carry this story. And I want to thank you and honor you, and I hope others of you will be able to talk to Patty in your time here, just for sharing that with me and with all of us. Now, the experience of teen girls being abused are really quite different. They are much more about seduction of a certain kind, and there's just two stories to talk about here. In both of these cases, these are troubled teen girls. In one case, a nun suggested that this priest, she come to her for counseling. She discovered her father had committed suicide several years ago, and she was just desperate for pastoral care. And a priest came to her school and began offering her that. But very, very quickly, he started calling her at home, sending her passionate love letters, and she found this very gratifying. And he spoke often and tenderly about loving her and made allusions to marriage and these other kinds of things. And so she believed that they were in a relationship together, and one that eventually, would turn into some kind of marriage. The second story is somewhat similar. This is a woman I call Angela who came from a domestically violent home. and comes into meeting this hip young seminarian, just really in his mid to late 20s, who quickly took an interest in her. I think she was 14 at the time, or just turned 15. He sort of wiggled his way into family life, which is, of course, a very common theme in so many of our stories. And soon her parents were regularly inviting him into the home. And she too sort of fell in love with him and believed that they had this, profoundly special relationship. The sexual contact came right with all of that, and both women said they knew this was wrong, but they had been taught that the priest was, the highest next to God, and so of course this must be right. And then because they were both so troubled, they were both hungry for the contact, as one of them put it to me. So these are cases in which there's the con. It's a simple con, really. You persuade the credulous girl that she's special, that you're in love with her, that God has given you both a special gift of sex as a means to express this love, and that all of this is an inviolable secret that other less enlightened persons would not understand, like parents and teachers and other adults in their lives. Again, this idea had been drilled into them that the priests were godlike, beyond reproach, and always right. And so both of these women said that they had no language, they had no tools or strategies to rebuff clergy molestation. Another important factor here to mention is just the trusting mothers who watched a lot of this happen and in some cases thought it was really great that their daughters were being treated as special by priests. Both of these women were getting love letters from these priests, and the mothers would hand them over like a silver platter, one of them said. So parental complicity, even eagerness for their daughters to be drawn into intimate relationships with priests, I think is a fundamental part of at least some of these stories that we're talking about here. I know my time is short, so I just want to make a couple of other points. There are a number of literary works, both memoirs and true-to-life novels that starkly depict these dynamics of seduction, I think, in really powerful and important ways. And I write about these in my paper, and would be glad to say more about those as well, because there's a number of really important, interesting books, I think, there. And finally, just very briefly, this question that Bob and others repeatedly call us to ask, which is, what is Catholic about the abuse of girls? We know sexual abuse is about power and control, among other things. It's about other things, too. And when it comes to girls, all priests are men. And when a priest abuses a boy, he is abusing someone who nonetheless has the capacity one day to become a priest, and many abused boys have become priests. But when a priest is abusing a girl, he's targeting a victim whose biological sex precludes her from priestly leadership in the church. And whatever age she is, she knows this. She may be inured to it, so she's hardly conscious of it as an observable fact. But I would say there is something distinct about the abuse of Catholic girls because of Catholic teaching about God's divinely ordered gender differences. And for me, that is a really critical point to interrogate, is just the gender divide within Catholic moral theology. And I know Doris has written about this, and I've learned from you, Doris, about this as well. And so this is another really critical piece of it. Of course, there's also the Catholic settings in which abuse takes place, which the rectory, the parochial school, and the ritual practices. More than one survivor has told me that she was raped with a crucifix. So this kind of ritual dimension of it. Girls also want to identify with the Blessed Virgin Mary, and endurance, this sense of forgiveness no matter what. So there's all kinds of ways, I think, that we can talk about the Catholicity of these kinds of cases, and that we want to get into here. Just to finally close this out, I just want to say that while I still consider the overall project to be one about female survivors, I'm increasingly convinced that the book that I want to write is about women's roles in the clergy abuse scandal much more broadly. So I'm interested across the board, really, in the mothers of victims. You know, some have defended their children, some didn't believe them or were intimidated out of doing anything. I'm interested in whistleblowers, the Jennifer Hasselberger and many others that have become known to me who've played a really critical role on that side of uncovering it. The journalists, the lawyers, many women have been involved in all of that and just publicizing important cases that have sort of forced the church to change some things. And members of diocesan review boards. I spent this last couple of weeks reading deeply in some of those kinds of diocesan review board decisions around priests, and it's just fascinating to think about women's roles there. And finally, also the women who've been hired by the church, by a diocese, to do intake reports and to deal with victims who confront the church. These are victim assistance coordinators and what they were titled before. Fascinating category because they're working for the church and they're advocating for victims and survivors. And can you do both all at once? So I'm interested in that kind of compromised position here. And I'm convinced from my conversations just with one that these stories are quite critical for breaking open the church hierarchy, silence on abuse. So many thanks for whatever light others of you are able to shed on all of this and other crucial topics relating to clergy sex abuse. Thank you.
So while Terry is walking to the podium, I want to note, and thank you, Marie, I want to note that there's something about the setting and the languages that we use, the translation of horror into scholarship that can seem to promise a certain protection. But I do want to note that the stories that are being told, the details of these stories are very, very, very upsetting. These are the stories you're going to be hearing about for the next day. So I want to urge everyone to do what you need to do to take care of yourselves and to reach during these presentations, to leave when you need to leave, just to walk out of the room when it's too much. And to reach out to others to talk when you feel the need to do so, because this is, we're trying to create narratives about this. We're trying to understand it critically, empirically, but the violence keeps breaking through, and you need to know that.
No videos at all. So
Not now.
And, okay. Since we don't have somebody in the audience who's going to be holding up time, let me set this.
I can move. You want me to move? I'll move.
No, yeah, I think this will work. Great. So, as everyone will, I want to start off by thanking the amazing people involved, beginning really with Father Jenkins, who allocated the money for this project, for which we're all very grateful. Kathy, who's led this so amazingly well. Pete, who's organized Lord knows how many Zoom meetings and taken notes and kept us all together and running smoothly. Bob, who, if I can be a little sentimental here, since we go way back, I don't think there's a session we've had that Bob hasn't offered kind of deep advice about reading around the topic, summarize things in a way that really opens the issue in a way we hadn't expected. He's been amazing. And everyone else involved in the project. It's been a very moving experience for me. I think you can probably imagine having hoarded these documents forever, and 20 years. And then all these amazing people, all you amazing people are working on them. So thanks to you, and thanks to the guests, thanks to the people working in adjacent projects. It's really great to have you here as well, because this is getting big, and that's exciting. So before we get going, this is a little odd, but this is an anthology of Ukrainian poetry. Now, since our catastrophe is not the only catastrophe going on right now, I thought I would show you this because I started reading it on the plane coming out here. And it was a beautiful experience because it gave me a sense of what an amazing place it is that transcended in some way all of the destruction we're seeing on the TV. So, I also want to say a huge thanks to the survivors, to Patty, to all the survivors that I'll mention. This is going to be a very survivor and document-oriented talk. It's probably a little too long, and I'll zip through it at the end. But that's really going to be my emphasis, to talk about survivors, talk about documents, and talk about how all of this hangs together, confession and abuse. That's Tom Blanchette sitting down in the middle there, and we'll get back to him in a moment. So where am I coming from? That's always a question. This is probably the most recent book on confession that's come out, and it's a great book. I wouldn't recommend it as a book about confession and abuse because I believe that topic, child abuse, is handled in a single footnote on page 311. So one place I'm coming from is having reviewed thousands and thousands of pages of documents. Confession is absolutely crucial in the abuse crisis. There are hundreds upon hundreds of cases. And I believe if we knew it all, there would be hundreds of thousands of cases. Because think of it, if a priest is abusing children, confession is going to figure in it. That footnote happens to be about the book that came out of this survey, The Dark Box, which was reviewed by an eminent scholar as being an angry book. And we've talked about this in our sessions. You know, how can you not be angry? This is a very, very useful book, a wonderful book, but it's a reformist book. And I think that's a temptation that I try to avoid because it changes the subject. I think it's good to stay with the reality that confession is integral and that abuse is intimately related to it. I'm also, it's odd to say, a little sentimental about confession. I spent 10 years in spiritual direction with an amazing priest named John Sassani in Boston, and it was a great experience. So I think it's good to remember that that's possible because one of the reasons why confession is so powerful in the whole abuse spectrum is that it is a powerful thing. I think if you approach it in too much of a reformist way, it's easy to forget that and to say, we've had it with confession, let's move on to something else. That's not my attitude. That picture you just saw is from this amazing book of photographs, and I highly recommend this. Go to her website. It's a book of photographs of homely confessionals, not the fancy carved things that usually wind up in the pictures. So I'm going to start with first confession, and I'm going to kind of shift gears here. This is Julie Stewart, who is an Australian survivor who was abused before, during, and after first confession. This is going to be a little rough. I'm going to be reading a lot of documents. It's not going to be easy. It may be triggering. I've tried to select away from that, but inevitably it is going to be hard. She was abused by Reverend Peter Searson, who abused many other girls, boys in first confession, and many other kids as well. This is a document that is basically her statement, and I'm going to read a little bit from it. She drew a picture of the abuse scene. You can see that basically the circle is the altar. The church fades away to the right, and beside the altar was a newfangled confessional with the possibility of sitting side by side or behind a screen. And she says, "I was always a happy, carefree little girl. I had really long hair down to my waist. I loved dancing and horses. I went to the confessional to practice for my reconciliation several times. Each time Father Searson told me I had to sit on his side of the partition and to sit on his knee. I did what he said because he was a priest. I do not recall that anything else happened on these occasions. Oh, nothing happened. Well, that nothing happened is important. The first 3 or 4 times I went to reconciliation, that's after First Confession and First Communion, Father Searson told me that I had to sit on his knee. On these first 3 or 4 occasions, Father Searson would laugh and stroke my hair. He would say to me, "Do you love Father?" And I said yes. He would ask me to kiss him on the lips. I did. On these occasions, I enjoyed Father Searson's attention. On about the 5th time I went to reconciliation, and on each subsequent occasion, Father Searson also touched me. On these occasions, he continued to ask me to tell him that I loved him and to ask me to kiss him. I did as I was told, but I no longer enjoyed it. When he started touching me, I understood that what he was doing was sexual and that it was wrong. If I knew which day my class was going to be called to reconciliation, I would wear tracksuit pants or stockings or bloomers to make it harder for Father Searson to touch me. And I know another survivor who did the same thing. The last time I went to reconciliation with Father Searson was sometime in the second term of 1985, when I was in grade 4. On this occasion, Father Searson lifted me from his knee and placed me on his lap so that I could feel his erection against my backside. He pushed me hard against him. It hurt. He whispered in my ear, "You are a good girl. The Lord forgives you." So that last sentence, crushing, very, very important, because what is a child to do with the complexity of that message? This is Reverend John Calnan. We'll deal with him in a little less detail. But he set up a kind of assembly line and digitally penetrated all the girls who came to him for First Confession. He was convicted numerous times of this, but Lord knows how many other instances there are. He's on probation in Ireland. He's not in prison because he was an old man and they felt he couldn't take it. But this is one quote. "I felt it was weird." This was the abuse experience. "And when I had finished my prayers, he placed his hand on my head and gave me his blessing. I left the room to go say my penance. I didn't tell anybody, and I didn't know if his actions were part of the confessional ceremony." So this is deepening the confusion, right? That the ritual of the church and the ritual of the abuse end up being one and the same. Doesn't just happen in Australia and Ireland. This is Reverend Donald C. Bolton. He's a Redemptorist. Apologies to Patrick. There's a good Redemptorist coming up. In the Pennsylvania grand jury report on him, we read this. Bolton's second assault on Jane Doe 1 occurred in 1977 when she was 8 years old. This time, Jane Doe 1 was preparing to make her first Holy Communion at St. Gregory. When she was practicing confession, Bolton entered her side of the confessional booth. He then slid his hands up her dress and pulled her panties down. He fondled her, rubbed his penis against her. When Bolton was done, he instructed Jane Doe 1 not to tell anyone because no one would believe a child's word against his word. Jane Doe 1 recalled this type of abuse occurred for 9 months, at least every other week. So I think we all agree this deserves more than a footnote. And think of all the first confessions still going on. We sometimes think of confession as passé. It's not passé to that extent. Every single child in America goes through this and potentially goes through that. So abuse does occur in confession as time goes on too. This is James Grine, who was abused by Cardinal McCarrick. Cardinal McCarrick needs no introduction. There he is with James during the abuse. A report came out in the Associated Press, and it goes like this. Grine testified that McCarrick, a close family friend who baptized Grine, would take him upstairs to hear his confession before celebrating Mass for the family at home. He touched James' genitals as part of the confessional. That became the course. It happened almost every time, Noacre, who was his lawyer at the time, said. McCarrick would absolve Grein and touch him on the forehead, shoulder, chest, and genitals. Noacre said, combining sexual abuse with a sacrament like confession haunts Grein to this day. And that is certainly true. I know Grein not well, but I saw him at McCarrick's arraignment a while ago. And it's something that is very, very difficult for James still. People are vulnerable in the confessional, very vulnerable, he said. If you manipulate that and try to sexualize that, it's extremely emotionally damaging. This is Terry Kohut, just a little while before he was abused by Reverend Lawrence Murphy up in Milwaukee. Murphy led the St. John's School of the Deaf for 24 years. You might know the story from an amazing documentary, Mea Maxima Culpa, but the documentary dubs voices in for the deaf people's signing. And as a result, I think it provides an easy interface for something that's actually much more complicated. The experience of a deaf person who finds it hard to communicate with the outside world generally when they are abused is especially orders of magnitude more difficult. As Terry is signing here, he's signing the symbol silence. Remember the big statue of Jesus hugging the children beside our old school. This is a letter that he wrote to Murphy. The statue showed him being very kind to them. You fooled us by copying that pose, got us close and molested us. You should have never been a priest in the first place. When I was older, about 17 or 18, Father Murphy was abusing me regularly. I would go to confession regularly. I never felt I made a good confession. I was abused by him. Then I would go to Mass, and I would not receive communion because he felt he couldn't. The religiosity of survivors and how confessional abuse summons all that up is a consistent theme in the hundreds and hundreds of cases that I've seen so far. I'm going to skip a little quickly here through Murphy. It is an incredibly rich file. It's 1,500 pages of depositions taken by the diocese, letters from the victims, very, very complicated back and forth with the Vatican over the rules of solicitation in the confessional, an absolutely remarkable file that probably deserves a book of its own. The Good Redemptorist, the one person I can see who blew the whistle, is this Father David Walsh, who's on the right there. And he went down and saw the bishop. He went down and saw the next bishop. He wrote to the papal nuncio. He tried his best to get people to pay attention to the story, to no avail. Murphy died in 1998 without ever really being punished. Father Daniel O'Friel is an Altoona, Johnstown priest, and this is a very strange one. The report on that diocese recounts, while O'Friel was principal at Bishop Carroll Catholic High School, he befriended a student who was interested in joining the priesthood. O'Friel became aware that the 16-year-old was romantically seeing a fellow female student. O'Friel would provide the student a ride home on an almost daily basis. During that time, O'Friel would ask questions about his contact with the girl, like, did you undo her bra or did you kiss? During these conversations, Father O'Friel would unzip his pants and the victim's pants, and they would touch each other's genitals. Father O'Friel joked with the victim that the conduct was, quote, an easy way to go to confession. The final assault occurred when the victim began to yell at O'Friel and jumped out of the car. For me, this is a kind of a strange strange evidence of the clericalism that we're grappling with, that we're trying to define and to deal with. The ease with which priests can joke, can be campy about these things. They live, it seems to me, often in a world that's very different from the world in which lay people live. And I think that's very important for understanding how confession works, how sacraments work in abuse. Another example of that, and I think I'll close. Father Lawrence Brett is a really important character in all of this. He was an eminent liturgist who for many years published a thing called Share the Word, which was an easy way for priests to prepare for their sermons. He was very, very well known, and he was a serial child molester. This is Frank Martinelli, who was one of his very, very tenacious victims and adversaries. There was a trial, and I'm going to read you just a little bit from this trial. The question goes to Martinelli. What, for example, did you do that your friends weren't doing? Well, I went to Mass every Sunday and every holy day. I believe I went to confession every Saturday. I, for a time, read from a prayer book, said my daily prayers morning and evening. For a time, I read a daily prayer book called the Breviary. Okay, well, what happened? Well, my recollection is that it was after confession. Most of the abuse that I've seen happens in that context. Confession is the referral point for the abuse that happens afterwards. He customarily walked. We did a walking confession outside frequently. Now, let me ask you that. A walking confession, was that something new and exciting at the time? For us, yes. How had you previously taken confession before this walking confession? In a confessional booth in the church. And had you done that for most of your life? Yes. So what happened? We were walking along, confession finished. We happened to be in the back of the school near this place he marked on the map. And then all of a sudden he stopped and began to pull down my pants and proceeded to perform fellatio on me, just like that. In another incident, we were in his car. He pulled his penis out. He asked me to bring my mouth down on it. And my recollection is that I must have hesitated because he said, "It's okay. It's another way of receiving communion." So again, the kind of kinkiness, the weirdness, the separate world that from which priest abusers very often approach the sacrament of confession and other sacraments. Now, it seems clear to me that the hundreds, and I think there probably are thousands of cases in the documents showing confession and abuse as related are highly significant, but I'm very, very interested in your perceptions on this, your advice about doing further research, and that's Bob calling me. And thank you for this arduous attention that you've had to pay to this.
Thank you, Terry. Kathy? Please.
Thank you, Terry, for that. Thank you, Bob. Thank you to all of you. This is not easy, and it has not been an easy project, but it's been a project that has certainly challenged and changed me as a scholar, and I'll share a little bit about that, about how that is as soon as we get the PowerPoint out. Okay. Just advance that way. Sorry, where's the...
That was very powerful. That was very powerful.
Oh, Terry, do you have the clicker?
So brutal.
No, thanks. Sorry, which I just want to...
No, you can't have a conversation.
My presentation foregrounds Catherine Mulcairn, a sister of St. Joseph of Boston, and the eponymous broken record referenced in my title. I'll explain that context shortly, but meanwhile, as a segue between Terry's presentation and mine, I'll begin with a source that illustrates a lesson I have learned from participating in GSP, Gender, Sex, and Power. That the sources on sex abuse often compel us to revisit and reinterpret sources and narratives that once appeared to be fairly straightforward. Sorry, it's not working, the advance. There's a window up. Pictured here is a cover of a self-published 1854 treatise intended to expose sexual crimes that allegedly occurred in confessionals and in convents. Given the evidence we now have that those spaces were in fact often sites of sexual abuse, it's difficult, if not disingenuous, to present these kinds of documents merely as anti-Catholic tropes in antebellum America. I remember showing this slide, which I've showed for many years in my classes, soon after reading the extensive file on Robert Meffin, a Boston priest who, under the guise of spiritual direction, initiated sexual acts with teenage girls, encouraging them to believe they were making love to Jesus Christ himself. In at least 3 documented cases, there are likely many more, Meffin persuaded young women to enter the Sisters of St. Joseph of Boston and continued to abuse them during and after formation. He admitted this after 2002, after the Spotlight scandal. According to one victim, Meffin told these girls that the scriptural imagery of Christ and his church as bridegroom and bride was not metaphorical but literal. He stopped short of intercourse, but only just short of intercourse. He told them intercourse was reserved for the afterlife. That also meant he did not believe he was breaking his vow of celibacy. Ordained in 1953, Meffin had not drawn negative attention from the Chancery until 1976 over a financial dispute, actually. As part of his defense on that occasion, he lamented that the archdiocese did not have more priests like those in Going My Way. Everyone loved them, and they did priestly work cooperating together. Talk about a source that is difficult, if not impossible, to teach now. A year later, the first allegation of a sexual nature surfaced against Meffin, but there's scant information on it. In 1984, Meffin informed the archdiocese that he could not accept any regular assignment because he was occupied with a mission confided to him by God, which he is bound to keep secret. That sounded ominous enough to convince Boston's auxiliary bishop, John Darcy, to recommend to Cardinal Law that Meffin not be reassigned, though, as would be true in the case of John Gagan and several other priests, Darcy's advice went unheeded, and it was Darcy who was reassigned, as many of us know, to the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. Darcy never spoke publicly about his role in the crisis, and it's impossible to know how closely he followed the revelations from his new home in Indiana. But there is reason to suppose he would have evinced a special interest in Meffin's case. Darcy's biological sister was a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Boston. And I take Marie's point about not wanting to do an archdiocesan history, but I think there is a lot of value in looking at a single archdiocese because you get to see these layers of relationships that you would miss otherwise. In 1986, a former CSJ approached the archdiocese alleging that Meffin had sexually abused her as a high school student, as a novice, and as a professed member of the religious community for 12 years. She met with a bishop who reported the allegations to Meffin, who in turn denied them, and that was that. 7 years later, another former member of the CSJ called the archdiocese. She had just seen Meffin on a Catholic television show promoting a new book and was absolutely sickened. She knew that Meffin had abused at least three CSJs during her own time in the community 25 years before. This time, the archdiocesan representative handling the allegation was not a priest or bishop, but a woman religious, Sister Catherine Mulcairn. Like so much scholarship on the clergy sex abuse crisis, Mulcairn's story refutes the ubiquitous bad apples theory long used to defend the church. In this case, the story features a good apple, a person who cared deeply about victims and who, through inside access, grasped the multitude and gravity of the crisis. and yet was complicit in the church's massive institutional failure. Mulcairn's story highlights the interlocking systems of power that created the Catholic clergy sex abuse crisis. The power of adults over children, yes, but also hierarchy over clergy, clergy over laity, which means in the Catholic tradition, men over women. Even, as we will see, courageous, intelligent, and experienced women who held significant positions of authority in the church. Mulcairn's involvement in the Boston clergy sex abuse crisis offers another example of how paying attention to sex abuse can complicate existing narratives. In this case, the story of Catholic sisters in the post-Vatican II era. The first 57 years of Mulcairn's life adhere beautifully to a very standard narrative. Born in Medford, Massachusetts in 1935, Betty Mulcairn, her Irish-born parents and younger brother, called her by a diminutive of her middle name, had first encountered the CSJs in high school, where, in her words, Mulcairn really grew to love the nuns and considered joining them because they just seemed to get along so well, and she perceived them as very smart ladies. She entered in 1954 at age 19 with 56 other women, and upon formal entrance received the name Sister Mary Martine. On December 6, 1992, by that point having long been using her baptismal first name, Sister Catherine, recalled the difficulties of her early years as a CSJ. The congregation required members' hair not only to be short, but entirely shaved. And Catherine's auburn hair had been a particular source of pride since her favorite teacher told her it was best described as Titian. The strict injunctions against particular attachments left her feeling lonely. She was frustrated when, after having earned a baccalaureate degree from the CSJ's Regis College, her superiors selected her to pursue a degree in library science at Simmons College. When asked why she couldn't study literature, which she loved, she was told, "We need library scientists." Through it all, Mulcairn remembers having a strong sense that this is going to change, this will change. And religious life did change. Sister Catherine would be at its vanguard. She was elected as a delegate to the CSJ chapter after Vatican II, in which the congregation resolved, in her words, to call themselves out of entrenched ways of thinking and to share life more fully with people. She spent 1966 to 1969 at the Order's Mother House, recalling it as a good moment, a lively time when prominent theologians like the Redemptorist Reverend Bernard Haring would visit. In 1969, she was elected to the leadership team of the congregation and would serve on it for the next 15 years, the final 6 of those, as its president. Her responses in the oral history allude to the qualities that made her an effective leader in a period she characterizes as one of cataclysmic change. She manifested an extraordinary ability to keep one eye on the individual, on the human, and one eye on the corporate, the institution. In any given moment, she could be attending to the problems of a member, present to them as they struggled with alcoholism, a problem in ministry, or a decision to withdraw from religious life. In 1 year, 90 women left the CSJs, and Catherine met with over half of them. And the next moment, she'd be making a decision related to the management of millions of dollars. There were moments when, in her words, I might be furious and angry personally, but at the same time, you've got to steer a course that you're not making enemies for the congregation. She recounts one confrontation with Cardinal Medeiros over a priest who was encroaching on the ministry of the sisters without permission of his provincial. Mulcairn pointed out the gender double standard, namely that the cardinal would have never let that slide if it had been a sister. Medeiros backed down. In 1984, Mulcairn served on an archdiocesan task force designed to restructure the archdiocese under Medeiros' successor, Bernard Law. Shortly after that, a diagnosis of breast cancer prompted her to resign her presidency. After her recovery, she earned a degree in religious studies at Fordham University and was missioned to a parish in a neighborhood where the mass exodus of nuns had precipitated the withdrawal of sisters from local schools. In Mulcairn's words, she went out and pounded the pavement and rang doorbells. If I could only talk to people with openness, I could overcome the bitterness and rifts. That ministry reinforced another principle that had guided her throughout her years in leadership. Openness and honesty led to reconciliation and healing. In spring of 1992, Cardinal Law personally invited Mulcairn to join the Chancery's Office of Ministerial Personnel. As Mulcairn recounts it, the revelations of the Porter case in New Hampshire had precipitated so many new victims coming forward that the sole person in that office, Father John McCormick, could no longer handle the volume. By the time she sits for the oral interview, Mulcairn has been on the job for 4 months. Her interviewer, another sister, characterizes her work as being on the cutting edge of the church in America. Mulcairn is more circumspect yet optimistic. Once again, she senses change on the horizon. She knows that affecting it will be hard, even traumatic. But she has a plan and she has experience. She has become one of the very smart ladies she had so admired in high school. She is poised to make a difference. It's therefore heartbreaking to read the oral history recorded in December 1992 in tandem with the transcript of another oral interview Mulcairn gave almost exactly 10 years later. On December 19, 2002, her 67th birthday, Mulcairn was deposed by attorney Roderick McAleish in the case of Ford versus Cardinal Bernard Law. I'm going to show a single one of its 571 pages. Let's start with the top. He asks her about priests raping nuns. Do you remember the case of Robert Meffin? Yes, she says simply. Now, on the second day of her deposition, they'll go into far more detail about the Meffin case, and it reveals that about her responses as well as case exhibits revealed that the initial phone call from that former CSJ, now a psychotherapist, had come in late January 1993, about 6 weeks after Mulcairn recorded the oral history. We can only wonder what went through Mulcairn's mind during that phone call and the weeks that followed when she reached out to the women in question, including the victim who had come forward in 1986. Though that woman's name has been redacted from the legal files, and I won't use it here, I discovered it easily enough through other sources and verified that she had entered in 1965 and withdrew in 1976. It's unclear how well Mulcairn would have known either this woman or Meffin's other victims among the CSJ. In the late 1960s, the congregation had about 1,800 members, and she was a dozen or so years ahead of them in community life. But even if she had not known them well, she surely was appalled to learn that during the same period she had remembered as so exhilarating and so exciting when prominent theologians visited the mother house, novices living just on the same property were being violated by Robert Meffin. And of course, she would continue that his abuse continued on her watch, so to speak, during her many years in leadership. All told, Mulcairn heard allegations of sexual abuse against over 100 priests between August 1992 and June 1994. She estimated that she had spoken to over 200 victims during that same period, 98% of whom she deemed credible. Let's move now to the part of the deposition transcript that comes immediately after the first Meffin reference, an excerpt from a memo dated May 18th, 1994. And I also have the actual memo. By this point, Mulcairn had been recommending for some time, she can't remember when, that the Archdiocese, upon hearing credible allegations against a priest, publish the dates of service in all the parishes in which he had been assigned. She had heard of a similar practice in the Archdiocese of Minneapolis-St. Paul, and remembers that her first thought was the people who had kept their secrets for years, that they might be freed if they knew they weren't the only victims. Her recommendations were never followed. Pressed by the prosecuting attorney, Mulcairn contextualizes the memo in gendered language. I wrote broken records, she said. Any woman saying anything 2 or 3 times or whatever times is a broken record. Though Mulcairn doesn't say this explicitly, the deposition also shows the gender dynamics that shaped her job description. It had been presented to her as originating out of a need for a division of labor precipitated by victim overload. But it functioned, in fact, as a differentiation of labor in which Mulcairn would meet with the victims and report to McCormick, who would in turn communicate with the accused priest. She recalls that she had always felt very free to say exactly what I was thinking to McCormick, but she was less certain, even at the time, that he listened, admitting that she always felt he was more on the side of the priests. He was. On April 12, 1993, McCormick sent Robert Meffin a summary of recent allegations. I realize that it is not easy to have such allegations made about you, Bob. I sense they are very upsetting. By the time she is deposed, Mulcairn has learned mostly through Boston Globe coverage about one of the most egregious cases, that of Joseph Birmingham, who had been a seminary classmate of McCormick's and who had been stationed with him at parishes where he abused young boys. I don't have time to go into this case, but she tells the prosecutors she does not remember, she cannot recall McCormick disclosing that information to her at any point at which they worked together. McLeish is gentle in his interrogation of Mulcairn. At one point he says, "You did a lot, sister." But he also presses her on what she did not do. Namely, she did not go to the police. She did not communicate to anyone beside McCormick the scope and magnitude of the abuse. She did not ascertain that Law knew what she knew. On that last point, she tells the prosecutor that, "I thought this would be communicated." She had understood herself, she uses this term time and time again, to be a conduit. She trusted that the system, the reporting chain, would work. She actually had very little interaction with Law during her time at the Chancery. She said she saw him just once or twice, including the time she had requested a personal appointment to tender her resignation. Even then, apparently the Cardinal's secretary forgot to write it down, and he was on his way out of the country, so he rushed her through it. They had 10 minutes together, during which, as Mulcairn later recounts, she told the Cardinal that she was spiritually, psychologically, and physically incapable of doing the work any longer. In the deposition, she elaborates using words like traumatized, worn down, nightmare. Because she considered victims' desire for confidentiality to be sacred, she found it difficult to, quote, "be pastorally present and not have anyone else to share or have a coworker after work or other places." She felt the isolation of the novitiate all over again. She expresses regret for not doing more, and she characterizes her decision to resign as a human failure, her own. From our vantage point, a more accurate reading of the situation would be human success on the part of Catherine Mulcairn and massive institutional failure on the part of the Boston Archdiocese. There is ample evidence that Mulcairn did her job with remarkable sensitivity. Here's a quote from one victim. One of Meffen's victims compliments her for treating her with respect and dignity and goes on to note that having been abused as a sister, she felt that talking to a woman religious was very beneficial. This survivor goes on to say that the most difficult part of the process was giving the graphic details of what happened. For obvious reasons, she chose to disclose her story to a woman, a non-male authority figure. Mulcairn may have been an authority figure, but in effect, she had no real influence. The mainstays that had guided her through her years in leadership failed her spectacularly in the 2 years she spent in the Chancery. She no longer trusted that openness would lead to progress. She no longer trusted in her own ability to mediate between the individual and the corporate. She no longer trusted that she could operate effectively as a leader within the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church. And I think it is in this sense that her story calls us to revisit this narrative of Catholic sisters in Vatican II. I've thought many times, what if I only read that oral history from 1992? I could use that to write a great story about Catholic sisters after Vatican II. But when it's read in tandem with this deposition, we learn a very different story. Mulcairn left Boston and served in the Diocese of Scranton, Pennsylvania for several years. As for Meffen, he was placed on leave in July of 1993 and granted senior retirement status in 1996. After that, he wrote a long explanation to Law in which he characterized himself as a prisoner of love in a cell of allegations. Pictured here is Law's response. Note that he compliments Robert Meffen on the depth of his faith and the courage of his heart. Remember, he couldn't give Catherine Mulcairn 10 minutes of his time. Thank you.
So I think these three papers really foreground and really showcase, I think, the challenges and the ambitions of this project. You see the way we've been searching for languages, the way we've been searching for methods, trying to figure out the right registers to approach various figures and contexts in. So there's a lot at stake in these historiographically and theoretically and morally, theologically, as well as emotionally. So I wonder if now we have time for questions, and I think the procedure is to have people walk to that microphone in the middle and ask questions there. But I want to invite you to come up and ask a question of any of the panelists or all the panelists.
Thank you all for those wonderful papers. I had a semantic and cognitive question that kind of unifies the three presentations. And the lexical question is really that when Marie talked about when priests were abusing boys, the word homosexuality was used. When those priests were also abusing boys and girls, a lexical category wasn't used, such as bisexual or polyamorous or the lexical categories we have now. There was no lexical category that was used, or perhaps it's an empirical question about were there any nuns abusing girls or boys? Because in the public press in this day, you constantly read these stories about school teachers that are high school teachers abusing boys or sexually assaulting boys or romancing boys and things of this sort. So I wondered why it was absent in the clerical abuse files. That is, were there no nuns who were abusing other younger novices or younger girls that have been recorded or litigated in the courts? And I guess the cognitive one was that the stories that often emerged in these narratives that you have in the Bishop's Accountability Archive are of young, particularly the young girls or the young boys, that they have no sense of the category of sex or sex abuse yet. So in my mind, it was like, when do these persons that are abused, because the litigation and the court cases come much later when they already have the notion of sex as a cognitive category in their existence and personhood. So when does that happen in relationship to the original forms of abuse that were practiced on them? Or at least those were the
Thank you,
questions.
Rudy. Who would like to address that question about nuns, language, category, absence? Yeah.
Briefly, Ramon, thank you so much for the question. To your first point, there is, for example, a really fascinating case in the St. Joseph's Orphanage files. It's an orphanage in Burlington, Vermont, where there's a lot of abuse by nuns of girls and boys. And the one that I'm most familiar with, a girl was sexually assaulted by this nun repeatedly in very strange ways. I think I've maybe talked too much about the details before, so I won't get into those details now. But and that's by no means an isolated case. And interestingly, a priest hears the girl's confession. She confides in him, and he goes to the Mother Superior, calls a meeting, and interestingly, despite the sacrosanct seal, actually takes action on the basis of what he learns in confession and protects the girl. So a good story among so many sad ones. So that in answer to your first question, but.
Just in terms of homosexuality, I didn't mean to imply that I think that I'm conflating pedophilia and homosexuality. As you know, there are all these debates, and I think a lot of politics around, putting this in the category of homosexuality. But I don't know if you were actually asking me about my particular lexicon, or you're really asking about the broader categories that people are using. Yeah, I think that's probably more of a Terry question also, or maybe Kathy, you know. Any polyamory in the text anywhere as a category, Terry?
There are certainly priests who offend against boys and girls. I've always found it interesting that given the common analysis that this is about power, not sex, there are priests who have gender preferences, although their behavioral patterns are certainly pedophilic rather than hebephilic or whatever. So I don't know what to do with that, but I think, Marie, you're absolutely right that there is an awful lot of variety in this. and any attempt to slot it into narrower understandings is wrong.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes,
Supposed to go over to the,
you are.
I can always, anyway. This was wonderful. I can't wait for the rest of the, I just want to say, first of all, very helpful, very powerful in a lot of ways. I want to ask, respectfully, if you will, as an old school historian type person, actually an old person, right, if you will, ask a framing question, okay? I don't think it's, I wrote to Kathy right before the session, and I said, these look great, these are looking, I mean, I can't wait, but where are the dates? For a historical session, there's not a lot of dates in the title, right? And as I listened to them, all extremely powerful and some of them unlistenable, right? You know, just because of the power. I started thinking about how there could potentially be two types of ways, you know, not incompatible, but powerful ways to tell this powerful story, depending on one's questions, if you will. One would be, if you will, what, more psychological and transhistorical, if you think of sin as a psychology, if you will, of evil, right? At that point, you don't necessarily care about whether something happened in 1957, right, or 1987, right? You don't really care about the larger context because it's evil and it somehow seems to repeat and repeat, right? Does that make sense? But being this old everything, right? If you think about, as I listened to Kathy's talk, especially, she put the dates in, you know, praise whatever, there were dates in there. I started thinking about a story that would be historical, right? And I know it's a long question, I apologize, it's just working it together. At that point, you take a look at the sexual revolution, and I know the church is gonna say, oh, it's not our fault, it's the sexual revolution, right? But if you start thinking about how does the church take in changing times and reject changing times, take some things in that are in flux and push other things away. You see what I'm saying? A different kind of story may perhaps emerge, which may or may not be true, because you've looked at all the archives, I have not. The story might be, I can't remember, this horrible guy born in, you know, he became a priest in 58 and then the sexual revolution happened. I'm old, I'm born in 52. I knew all these old guys who felt like I've missed it and they start coming on to younger girls. And I wasn't Catholic, I'm talking sexual. You know what I'm trying to say? I will wind up, I can see that coming. So the question becomes, is there a reason in terms of your goals of writing, if you will, to look at like how the church over and over, you know, harms people? Or could one also tell a story of how the church takes, if you will, takes in the wrong aspects of gender and sexual revolution? Because, final point, you all know, right, that that abuse of children was a feminist issue brought up by feminists in the 1970s, claimed by feminists, and I didn't think the church took on many of those on purpose, you know. Okay, that's fine.
So a question about dates.
So thanks, Gail. And when you wrote to me just a couple hours ago, pointing out that only actually Pete has dates in his panel title, and I love dates. That's what I do. It's change over time. That's what I do. So I started to think, why didn't I put dates? And I think because I was focused on Mulcairn. I mean, it's really, she worked for 2 years in this, but I wanted to tell the story of her whole life. Yeah. And I also wanted to tell the story of post-Vatican II. So it actually, like, if you had forced me to put dates, I'm not sure what I would have put in it. I guess you'll hear me say this a number of times, I think, over the next couple of days, but the subtitle of our project is called Toward a History of Catholic Sexual Abuse for a reason. That toward, we're aware at the beginning and continue to be aware that we don't know how to historicize this, how to tell this story yet. And we're just, our projects are, and we don't have someone who's looking at nuns abusing children. I mean, that's another part of the story that we don't have. So I think your framing is really helpful and interesting. But to me, that's why it's like, I don't know how to put dates around this. I mean, I think 2002 is a big date, right? I think a lot of us want to show that it didn't all disappear in 2002. The issues that I'm talking about with gender and hierarchy certainly didn't disappear in 2002. So that's my response.
Yeah, it's great to see you again, Gail. Yeah, I love your question and I appreciate it so much because I think you're absolutely right to surface that there are dimensions of this, maybe for all of us, but certainly for me, that feel like this timeless, more theological, deep, issues in that way. But I think we have actually in our conversations paid a lot more attention to dates than maybe what you're hearing a lot of it is, in what era were particular abusive priests ordained and where, right? So that actually those kinds of things have really mattered. We have definitely talked about the 1960s as a, whether it's a catalyst or it becomes an excuse or a justification, right? And thinking about context. So I hear you and it's a good reminder, but I do think that our projects, I think you'll hear more tomorrow, really are set in contexts and times and locations. Class and race have been important factors. So just a reminder, for us to highlight that. But anyway, thank you.
If I can just quickly say something here. Oh, Terry, sorry.
Yeah. So just a quick comment. Underneath there, even if you're going to look at confession from a trans-historical perspective, inevitably you're going to include history. Even the ritual objects of confession, whether it's a confessional or a newfangled confessional or the priest's car, which functions as a sort of cool confessional in a lot of these stories. History is implied in that. And the dark box would claim that confessional reforms in the early 1900s were crucial for what happened throughout the century as far as confession goes. So there are a lot of dates there, and I think I absolutely agree with you that the dates are interesting and important.
If I can just quickly add here that I don't think any statement chills me more than one that begins with "I'm an old school historian," because I know that's always going to fall. There's going to be a reprimand coming. So no dates, for example. I have to say that one of the things that this project raises is problems of chronology and temporality in history. It has lots of complexities about this history. You tell a story of confession, you can tell it as a modern history, you could tell it as a trans-historical. So there's always been, I think, a lack of fit between Catholic historiography and history as a modern discipline. And this project, I think, raises that. So we're old/new school Catholic historians. Yes?
The race is on here.
I have a date for you. 1974.
A great year.
1974 was the year that the USCCB, or NCCB back then. Oh, sorry. The NCCB changed the rules for confession. No longer just going behind the grill, but you had the opportunity to go into a small chapel or a room dedicated to face-to-face confession. That was momentous for me because as a young parochial school student, whose family went to Mass regularly, I saw on a Sunday something kind of unusual, and it stuck with me all these years. We had a young priest, tall, slender man, very handsome, tremendously handsome, ridiculously handsome. And we had a sister in our parochial school, pretty sister, vivacious, lovely person, and confirmed by my female classmates. Oh yeah, she's the pretty one. Everybody knew. So when it came time to teaching the parish what this face-to-face confession would be about, or how it would go, the handsome priest and the pretty sister, during the homily, substituted a skit for the reflection on the gospel. So the two of them went before the altar, sat in two chairs, and pantomimed a kind of confession. This is how it would go face to face. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been a week since my last confession. Sister, I know you've been good all this week. What could possibly be on your mind? Well, I got upset with little Johnny during school, and the parish laughed. And they went on in this little skit for a little while. And in 1974, the handsome priest and the pretty nun showed us how to do it. But he eventually ended up on one of the diocesan lists as a serial abuser, John Coons. I won't tell you the name of the sister. She's still alive, and she's still as vivacious as ever. But the thing that I want to stress here, it's not so much the nice story about how we did the transition from the confessional box to the face-to-face. It's that our personal experiences matter a great deal for how we nail down those dates that matter for the wider story. My 1974 is not going to mean a hill of beans to Pete, who wasn't even born yet. Yeah, so, that kind of context, our own experience matters for how we think about all of what you've laid out.
And that's also why we have archives, so that we could, those of us who weren't born at a particular time can access that. Patty, please, you get the final question.
First of all, thank you, all of you. I mean, you did an outstanding job honoring those of us that have had to suffer. You really are capturing the essence of the pain and the hierarchy, the abuse of power that comes from the Pope, the cardinals, the archbishops, the bishops. So I really don't want to lose sight of that piece. But as far as the date, from my point of view, 1985, when Richard Sipe and Thomas Doyle presented to the U.S. Catholic bishops, their findings, Terry and I know this, their findings of clergy sexual abuse in the United States. From 1985 on, there's no excuse in my book that this continued. It's just unbelievable to me. Bright people presented, and then they were targeted and alienated because they were bearers of the truth. And those of us, including myself, my family, and all of us that have suffered this way, that stick our necks out, the level of scrutiny and resistance from Catholics is massive. So we have a long way to go to break silence and the denial that exists throughout our country and throughout the world. The other really important fact here, let's not forget, this is critically important. This is criminal behavior. Sexually abusing a child is a criminal act. And when I'm in Catholic circles, we can get lost, sorry if anybody's going to be offended, but into religiosity, Catholicism extraordinarily, and sound so holy, right? And miss, this is criminal activity that in other circles is treated very clearly. So there's no discussion from my point of view about when a child is harmed, the adults around need to do something. So I've been speaking about this since 1991. We had a case in the state of Wisconsin. We were told it was the first case against the Catholic Church in the state of Wisconsin. We believed the church would respond to us. My parents, hardworking family, incredible group. My family, my husband, our kids. We stood together. And the level of resistance and animosity and pain and anguish perpetrated on us because of our truth-telling against a holy institution that's never supposed to look this way is beyond comprehension. So I honor this project massively. I'm massively relieved that you're bringing words to what all of us have ached for the validation, and that the victims, me and others, that we've had to do the damn hard work. And now I can hand it over. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Keep going. Yeah.
Well, and thank you. So we're at the end of this session. Thank you again to Marie and Kathy and Terry for their papers, and to all of you for your questions. I wanted to very briefly, before we go, say something about the picture that we chose for the cover of this, so that it's not, I can't speak for everybody. I chose it. Kathy sent out an email late one day. I was sitting in my study in Evanston, and I went through a whole series of sublimations. There were angry images, outraged images. I mean, it was an interesting little bit of art therapy, trying to find an image. And I don't mean to speak for everybody when I say what my thinking was, but I was struck by this image in particular because this is a moment when Francis has mistaken the call, God's summons. So God says, repair the church. And as I understand this picture, this is the moment when Francis has made a mistake and he's repairing the actual church, which is not really quite what the intention was. And my thinking was this. John, you're looking at me like, why is Orsi commenting spiritually on this? Has something gone wrong with him? You didn't know I could do this kind of hermeneutics, huh? My thinking was that any kind of reparations, any kind of repairs that have been undertaken, putting putting windows in rectory doors, and coming up with little programs for this or that, is that. And that's something far more radical it was called for. Francis was being called to something far more radical. And I think the only way to do that radical work is by the kind of empirical, close-grained empirical scholarship. Maybe not the only way, but one of the ways is by the kind of scholarship that this group has aspired to do. In other words, we're not talking about the benefits of putting windows in doors in rectories, however beneficial that might be. We are talking about something far more fundamental, which is the very nature of Catholicism as it has gone through time. So that's what that is about. Okay, we now have opportunities for conversations outside of this room. There are many bars in the Morris Inn, at least there used to be. Maybe the new Notre Dame, they don't have them. There are even bars, there's bars off campus. There's no lack of beverage here. So I hope to continue this conversation in other ways. Thank you all.